Welcome to the Pro Social Workers Podcast, the place where social work meets diversity, dialogue, and ethical practice. Here we offer courses that promote viewpoint and political diversity while fostering human connection. And the best part? Our content is completely free to access. For professional social workers and interested others, we provide the option to earn continuing education credits with a simple fee after listening to our episodes. Go to prosocialworkers.com to learn more. Together, we'll explore how to truly put the social back into social work. So, tune in, get inspired, and join us on this journey towards a more inclusive and connected future.
Hello, and welcome to the Pro Social Podcast, part of Pro Social Workers. We are an affiliate of the Institute for Liberal Values, and we promote viewpoint and political diversity in social work. My name is Matt Watson, and I'm the Executive Director of Pro Social Workers. I'm joined today by a prior guest, Dr. Dave Derozotes from the University of Utah School of Social Work. Dr. Dave has a lot of experience in promoting dialogue practice and promoting viewpoint and political diversity and pluralism in social work. And he has many similar experiences in education as well as practice. And he's done a prior podcast with us on dialogue practice in social work. Today, we're going to focus a little bit more on dialogue practice in clinical social work. And Dr. Dave, welcome, and please say a little bit about yourself and what we're going to talk about today.
Well, thanks, Matt, to you, and this is fun for me to talk about something that's important to me. Dialogue has always been important to me, even when I was a little kid. And, you know, a blessing in my career has been having the opportunity to actually teach a dialogue class at the university, which became very popular. It was first part of the Peace and Conflict Studies program that I started at the U, and then it became populated by students from all over campus, including social work. This presentation that you've asked me to do is especially about clinical social work. You know, people probably traditionally, I think it's fair to say, don't associate dialogue with clinical social work, but, you know, probably the main idea of what we're talking about today is that, in fact, one could view everything in clinical social work as a part of dialogue practice. And let's see if I can convince your audience, Matthew, that there's some truth in that. And the reason we want to go that way is because dialogue practice could become a part of social work curriculum in schools, because the skills involved in dialogue, I believe, and we believe, you know, is useful not only in what we call clinical social work, but also in addressing the biggest challenges that face humanity today, Matthew.
You bet. So say a little bit more about that. I'm interested in your thoughts about, some might see dialogue as inherent in clinical social work practice, where conversations and so forth are part of what you do. Tell us the other side of that and how dialogue may be seen as, I don't know if it's controversial, but why wouldn't it be just part of clinical social work?
Yeah, thank you for that. I suppose that just like any other discipline, we have conventional curriculum, you know, and in the schools of social work that I've taught in at UC Berkeley and then at DU in Utah, you know, practice is divided up into micro, meso, and macro. Dialogue really cuts across all three.
Yes.
And, you know, I really practice more in clinical than I do in macro, but I've worked on all three levels and find that the skills involved, you know, the knowledge, skills, and values involved in being a dialogue facilitator inform me in all three levels, you know, and it's my belief that, you know, the social work curriculum of the future at the schools that students attend, either undergrad, MSW, or PhD even, ought to include classes that emphasize dialogue facilitation, which are a little bit different. The goals and the actual skills are a little bit different than what we traditionally and currently teach in clinical social work. I was a clinical social work professor, taught the individual, couple, family, group content for years, and incorporated dialogue and found the students really liked it, and it finally made sense to them that there is a connection across these three areas, which are kind of arbitrary and I find not helpful to divide up our practice world into micro, meso, and macro. I find it more helpful to think about it all as forms of dialogue, and I'll try to talk about what that means. Maybe we could advance to the first slide to do that. Thank you.
You bet.
Matthew is going to be my slide helper. So we could start by saying that the purpose of dialogue is to help people form relationships across the differences that currently divide us. And if there's one thing I hear from people, I don't know if you hear it where you live, but I would imagine you do, Matthew. One thing I hear from folks in the social work community, as well as my own client base and people, I do volunteer work at a senior center, so I work with older people as well as younger people. Is everyone talks about polarization and how it's a bummer, but also we throw up our hands typically and like, I don't know what to do about that, right? And that's what dialogue addresses. And I think that every time I see a client individually, micro, or if I do so-called meso, which is somewhere in the intersection between micro and macro, or if I make macro level interventions, it's really dialogue in the sense that I'm trying to help people form relationships across the differences that divide us. And let's look more at what that means. Can we go to the next slide, please?
You bet.
Thank you. So I like to talk about Martin Buber just for a minute. When I'm having a tough day and I'm trying to figure out how to get folks to have a dialogue, a civil conversation, a friend of mine and I, we're both social workers. We do a radio program here in Salt Lake City where we invite guests to come and dialogue about differences, and my friend David Parker and I also do some dialogues with social work practitioners for CEUs. Actually, any of your listeners can attend that if they're NASW members for free. But Buber kind of gives me courage and strength because Matthew, was living in Europe during World War II, and his family, many family members that he loved, were killed by the Nazis during World War II. And he, when the war was over, decided that the most important thing he could do for his own sanity and development, as well as for the world, is to have dialogue with people who were Nazis during World War II, and which takes a huge amount of courage, I think. And he that's what he did. He had conversations and brought together people and who were both perpetrators and victims. We could use that language of not just the Holocaust, but of other locations in Europe where folks from Germany ended up putting people in concentration camps and sometimes murdering them. And and he writes about this. Those of you that are watching this can Google or GD chat, go on AI and check out some of Buber's works. He's published quite a bit. Maybe we can go to the next slide, please.
You bet.
So, what exactly is dialogue practice? We mentioned already that it bridges the knowledge, skills, and values of dialogue practice are applicable to all three levels of social work: micro, meso, and macro. And we mentioned the goals as bringing people together, to form a relationship. And I always thought that Fritz Perls had a point back in the late 60s when he said, most of American psychology is a process of endless self improvement rather than an acceptance of myself and others in the here and now. Dialogue is, Matthew, kind of a here and now practice where people get together in a circle. And I find it exciting to be a facilitator because you never know what's going to happen. Not that predictability is there typically, but in a group, anything can happen. And that provides a challenge and excitement. And in the here and now, people, and we'll talk a little bit about more of this today, but people can have various levels of structure in the dialogue based on how much structure they need, you know, to carry on a conversation. So, in some cases, because, the people are, we could say, high functioning in a dialogue group, and I don't anticipate a lot of difficult uh, 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 anticipation for participants. I might not structure very much and just say, um, what's on people's minds today? With a group that we could sometimes call it intergroup dialogue, where we have two groups that typically don't talk to each other in our communities and tend to have stereotypes about each other. I might have more facilitation and structure. For example, I might have a longer check-in and say, everybody tell me what you had for breakfast. And so people are kind of moving their jaws and practicing listening to each other. And we might go over the ground rules, which I'll cover towards the end of the presentation today, which are essential, I think, to our success. So one difference between traditional social work practice, I think, and dialogue is that, the focus is not so much on intervention, but an organization, but more holding space and facilitating. So uh, uh, the participants in the dialogue are co-facilitating, and they have as much responsibility as I do in the progress. That's not unique. Research has always shown that our clients have more to do with outcomes than we do, and that just makes logical sense. But in dialogue, there's a feeling of co-creating these relationships together. I
So
also go ahead.
um, in some ways, clinical practice is about kind of promoting change or bringing about some type of specific outcome, where with dialogue, it's more about co-creation. It's not necessarily um, towards a potential end, but dialogue can be both a means as well as an end in dialogue practice. Is that right?
I think that's fair to say, Matthew. In addition, um, I don't have as a goal to relieve your symptoms,
Okay.
which is a lot. I think of what we do and what we call therapy today is symptom reduction. Rather, it's that we are here together um, to to start to develop an inclusive community. Inclusive means welcoming, a space where I can both speak and listen.
Mm-hmm.
And I like to say hold space. I think that's a cool phrase, which means that we typically sit in a circle, like many cultures, and in current and ancient times, many people in many cultures sat in circle, to have conversations, sometimes once or more a day, in their community. And so, we're practicing co-creating an inclusive community because most of us don't have such a thing. We may belong to some kind of an organization, or live in a neighborhood, but we may not know even our neighbors' names. We may not feel very connected to the people in the institutions we attend, schools, churches, and so on. And we may not have inclusivity, which means that I get the benefits of a community, but I don't give up my individuality. So, that we accept the diversity of people in that community. And I would say that even though currently what we call EDI is under attack, we're all aware of that, it's become politicized. I think that what that's really truly about, which is welcoming people, and
Yeah.
that uh, and it's a space where everyone's voice is important. Uh, that is something that is timelessly important.
You bet.
Not just to our comfort locally and, feeling a part of my community locally, but also to our very survival as human beings globally. Because if we can't, because dialogue tends to foster cooperation, and without cooperation, there's no way we're going to deal with climate change or,
You bet.
preparations for mass casualty wars and or even epidemics, future epidemics, and any other threats to our survival. Next slide, please.
You bet.
Thank you. So, what do we do in dialogue? Well, we could break it down in phases, and this first phase, Matthew, engagement and assessment, sometimes is the key one and the hardest. To 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 find a space that most people would agree to sit in, to invite people to a dialogue and explain what that is, because practically every high school in the country has a debate team. We couldn't find one dialogue team in a high school in the country. I'm not saying there aren't
Really?
any. Yeah, so we started some in Salt Lake. So think about that for a sec, that we all have training in debate where there's a winner and a loser, and we use our intelligence, to win or lose in a conversation. Whereas dialogue is not about winning and losing; it's about cooperation. Shouldn't we be doing that in high school and even middle school and grade school? And it's certainly possible to have dialogue. I've done it with people, even in grade school level, across the lifespan, and maybe
Really?
more important now than ever. So, in engagement and assessment, we try to explain to people that this is not a debate, and so in the classroom, we'd have the students bring in guests, and they would have to go through that and explain what dialogue is, make them feel welcome when they come into the classroom. And many of our groups were frightened to come to the university and were afraid, what would happen. Um, we want to, focus on relationship building in dialogue, and and in doing that, some of the techniques that often are helpful are checking in at the beginning. I mentioned that earlier, where people just start a conversation. We call it a warm up about something that everybody participates in, like what you had for breakfast, but it could be, what'd you do last weekend, or how do you like the fall weather? Something that in which we all kind of remember our common humanity. And then there's always other process pieces, like if you have I'm doing a dialogue now monthly at a library locally. If we get a big turnout, we'll sometimes break people up into smaller groups for part of the time, which is usually about an hour and a half. We found it an ideal time for a dialogue is about 90 minutes. And, we can go more into detail on some of these process pieces. And finally, you want to do some kind of evaluation and follow up. I'd like to go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So this is just brief, and there's a lot of information on this slide, but essentially we could say that we can use the paradigms of practice and apply them to dialogue. And what I mean by paradigms, I'm thinking of Maslow in one of his later books talked about 4 phases of psychology that inform practice: psychodynamic, cognitive, behavioral, experiential, and transpersonal. You can read about these in a number of places online if you want to inform more. Also, we can add some other ones, for example, um, whole body, or work that addresses uh, conversation about uh, the fact that we have a physicality, we live in a body, and there are other paradigms as well that people have proposed. Um, Dialogue can utilize methods from all of those areas of psychology. For example, in psychodynamic, which addresses the past, often we can ask people to tell stories that on the topic that we're addressing. Cognitive behavioral, we could ask people to talk about ideas, or beliefs that they have, which sometimes is the safest one to start with. Experiential, we could have a dialogue that addresses how do you feel. In fact, we can even define empowerment, which is a social work term we use a lot, as knowing what I think and feel and expressing it effectively. Dialogue gives people an opportunity to practice that. And finally, transpersonal addresses the spiritual aspects of being a human, which are different, but sometimes related for some people to their religiosity. Let's go to another slide, please.
Let me ask you, excuse me, before we go to the next slide,
Sure.
kind of internal dialogue, if you will, kind of addressing dialectics.
Yes. Yeah.
And
What a great topic.
yeah. Dialectical behavior therapy, for example. We had a presenter, we've done a course on dialectical behavior therapy and
Yes.
within social work, and how, that relationship with oneself and addressing kind of conflicting perspectives or values. Would you
That's
see
right.
that as another model that might be kind of effectively implemented through dialogue practice?
Yes. So DBT and most of the therapies that end in T these days, ACT and,
Yeah.
and CBT. Generally, in my textbooks, I put them in the cognitive behavioral paradigm.
Okay, great.
Because, I mean, people say there's been 3, some even say 4 waves in CBT over since the early 1900s, and dialectical behavioral therapy arguably is in that the 3rd wave, according to some theorists.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and there is no such thing as a model that we can't apply some of the techniques in dialogue. And I've tried this, in different ways with different groups. And one nice thing about this, and reason I spent some time on this, is it enables the facilitator to suggest approaches to conversation that might fit the participants. Imagine, for example, sometimes we had a group of students who identify as voting Democrat and another group that identifies voting Republican, and they come together, and there often was tension, and and so it might turn out that using kind of an intellectual conversation moves us away from the goal of relationship building, because people start making citations and references and tend to kind of try to tend to debate, because that's what we used to doing when we talk cognitively, about knowledge.
Right.
And so we might switch to experiential and say, what are y'all feeling now in the room? Well, it feels tense. It doesn't feel safe. What would make you feel safer? And so you can also move back and forth fluidly with some of these techniques, to, if you notice that the drift is towards argument, and that can happen really easily when there's conflict, and especially
Right.
with groups that tend to stereotype each other.
So in some ways, dialogue practice can be trans-theoretical, trans
Yes. Yeah.
model,
Yeah.
if you will. It really integrates practice, interpersonal practice, social practice across various models.
Yeah. So it's exciting. And
Yeah,
having been involved in training people to do dialogue, I think that most students are capable of becoming facilitators. And one of the best ways to start is to be a participant and just
right.
feel what dialogue is like.
Very good. Very good.
So maybe we could talk a little bit about these different modalities, and how they can be dialogic, so to speak. So when I see a client one-on-one, there is a dialogue taking place between me and the other, which Buber talked about. And Buber called that confirmation of otherness. So when I sit with an individual on I can confirm their otherness in Buber's language, and try to form a relationship across the differences that divide us. And one of them, of course, is I am the practitioner, you are the client, and uh, and so that's a little bit different way of conceptualizing individual psychotherapy, what we usually call it, um, and that can allow us some other alternative goals and practices which we could talk about. I find that exciting and alive, to do that, and to even talk with the client about um, uh, uh, what dialogue is and how we're participating in that. And if you go to the next slide, we
I
can
think
look.
also with the individual work, the healing factor oftentimes is hearing and being heard. That somehow
Yeah,
that there is some healing quality that happens to validate and to feel heard. And I can see how dialogue practice would be really effective within that individual modality. Not to mention, helping to identify and address those internal dialogues that go on and mediate some of those dialectics.
yeah, I agree. In fact, yeah, I might use just a slightly different language, but I think we're talking about the same thing that I
Yeah,
experience.
yeah,
And being a human, and I'm sure you do too, as most other humans on the planet do, there's always a dialogue going on inside of me. And there's
exactly.
different ways to conceptualize that. Like one of the ways that I was taught, when I was in the MSW program in the early 80s, was the ego states, which were the inner parent, the ego, and the inner child, which are in dialogue. You could, and there's an analogy between that and parts of the brain dialogue, frontal cortex, limbic system. You can even have a dialogue between body parts, which we called whole body earlier. What does my head say about this? My head, my heart, my intestines, my gut. You sometimes have a gut feeling. What does that chill down my spine have to say?
Mm.
About what's it saying about my experience in this room with you? Couple work is a little bit more obvious dialogue, right?
You
There's still
bet.
that internal dialogue you're talking about, Matthew, but there's also three of us in a room now, and I'm holding a space for these people that are in usually some kind of romantic relationship. And I about half my practice now is with couples, and um, I like creating a space for them to have a conversation in which they can talk about anything. Now, is that radically different than how people do couple work? Arguably not necessarily. But if the goal is, forming a relationship across the differences that divide us, let me just say briefly that research shows, that in the stages of relationship, we go from kind of an idealization in what in the West we call falling in love to a demonization in the
Mm.
second phase of a relationship, which we call, the power struggle. And I find it really useful to use dialogue techniques to help couples with that roller coaster of falling in love where the other person is, I imagine, being near perfect to, all of a sudden crashing into demonization where it's hard for us to find something we like about each other, which is very common in what we call love. If we move to the next slide and we look at, the family level, and of course now we got even more people. And now the differences that divide us aren't just necessarily the characteristics that each person in a couple have, or the practitioner and the client, but now we have different age groups, right? And generations. And we're trying to bridge those on the family level. And a lot of the same kinds of perspectives apply here, as well as one more slide, please. If we do group work, which is what people usually think of in dialogue. And let's just say, although there's many ways to categorize it, you could think about the group we do as either one term for it that we used on campus was affinity groups and intergroup dialogue. So affinity groups would be, let's say we want to get people identify as male and people identify as female, or people identify in other categories together to talk. We could offer affinity groups for people in any of those subgroups to meet and just talk with folks that identify similar to them. And at some point, we could bring them together for intergroup dialogue where they have conversations. There's value to both, right? And even in a group of, let's say, for example, people who identify as female, there's going to be differences that divide us, you know. But those differences might become more apparent when we meet then with people who say, let's say, identify as being male, you know. And that can become challenging and exciting when we talk about some other divisions that are that often make people less comfortable. For example, race, you know, or sexual orientation, and so on and so forth. And we've done those kinds of groups successfully on campus over the years. And what I mean by successfully is that people report that they did indeed start to form relationships across the differences that divide them. So maybe let's move on again. And, you know, here's another simpler way to think about what are some of the components of a dialogue. We try to set it up, get people agree to come. We're going to try to do this thing called dialogue. We do a warm up, maybe check in. How's everybody doing? The actual dialogue takes place. I like to ask, does anyone have a takeaway if we have time? And, you know, maybe not, we don't always have time for everyone to speak. And then often a one word checkout if we're running out of time. Give me one word or maybe a sentence that describes, your experience of what happened or what you'd like to share to the group. Another slide. So this slide and the next one coming up are the ground rules that we typically use. These have been developed over time, and what we find is that people will generate similar rules regardless of whether they're teens living in Philadelphia, seniors in San Diego, or children in Florida. These are things that seem to be universal for most of us. And I think the two most important ground rules are in the do's: to listen for understanding and speak respectfully. So listen for understanding is worth talking about. It sounds like a simple idea. People say, oh yeah, listen for understanding. I do that. And I'll say, really? What do most people in our culture do when someone else is talking? You know, and if you ask yourself honestly, the tendency is to do what? I'm preparing to say what I'm going to say, aren't I? Right?
Yeah.
My friends who identify as indigenous, Salt Lake City has a large indigenous population. They say one of their favorite things in many tribes is, you know, that Creator gave us two ears and one mouth for a reason. You know, because we need to listen twice as much as we speak. I like that saying. You know, and so listen for understanding is actually listen to what you're saying. You know, it doesn't mean I have to agree because I listen. But listen to the extent that I could tell you what I just think I heard.
Mm-hmm.
And then speak respectfully. You know, it's hard to explain. I like to ask people, what does respect mean to you? And when someone, I was just meeting with a client this morning who was talking about his friend who speaks disrespectfully to him, and that was really important to him. I always like to bring up the song RESPECT, Learn Now What It Means to Me, and see if anybody wants to sing it. Get a few laughs, but also to think about what does it mean to me? You know, and that's the dialogue in itself. Speak for myself means like if I identify as let's say a white male, it's still not fair for a facilitator to ask me to speak for all men, nor do I want to encourage that. I might say, like sometimes people will say, well, you know, men feel this way, and I'll say, you know, Dr. Dave, could you please just speak for yourself that you feel that way? You know, why? Because it makes puts us in a relationship rather than speaking abstractly about a group that I can't really fairly speak for.
It
Offer
also
amnesty.
humanizes and kind of helps break down stereotypes or group identities, kinds of things, and
That's right.
it's really I think critical to do that.
That's right. And by the way, I was part of the Center for Teaching and Learning Excellence at the university for years, and I would bring these out with the trainings for new faculty in early fall when new faculty would come on campus, and we'd suggest they put these in their syllabus or maybe even put it on the wall because these things can apply to classroom teaching as well as what we call therapy. Or, we were talking about micro, meso, and macro, right? So, however you want to conceptualize teaching, the teaching is, um, in fact, we called our program Transforming the Classroom into Inclusive Communities. And so how can I make maybe what we'd call a meso space into an inclusive community? Offer amnesty is kind of a cool idea. I think that we forgive each other when we don't follow the ground rules perfectly because they're a different way of relating. And we unless people are egregiously ignoring them repeatedly, we try to help each other see how we're acting, and to become aware and help each other to follow these ground rules that make the dialogue possible. Waiting at least 3 turns to speak is obviously important, because we want everyone to be able to participate. And this last one I think is very cool too, Matthew. Owning my biases, judgments, and projections.
My values, yeah.
We hardly ever do that. We hide, don't we, our judgments? A friend of mine who's a Buddhist monk told me when he started his training with his teacher, the very first thing the teacher did was have the students sit in a circle and share their judgments about each other. What? Why would you want to do that? Because usually we only share judgments in anger, or when we're activated emotionally. But to share judgments with love can be healing and transformative. For example, I would have a mixed race group of people, and we were talking about the subject of race, and I'd ask people to sit in small breakout groups where they would talk about what stereotypes they notice they have about each other. But the purpose is not, of course, to attack or make people wrong or elevate my position, but it's for understanding and for healing. Healing in Latin means to become whole, and one of the impediments to becoming whole is, we're embarrassed to admit our judgments, our biases, our projections, but being able to say them in a space where other people are trying to do the same thing can be healing and transformative because we're owning parts of ourselves that we don't usually do publicly. Not with a great shame, like I'm such a terrible person, but I notice that this comes up for me when I encounter you. And that's the kind of work that can really make a difference in relationships. I do that with couples. What are the biases that you had of each other when you first met, the first date? And what are the biases and stereotypes you have about each other now? Have they changed? How are they the same? How are they different?
Seeing how it changes over time, it evolves over time, and our humanity evolves over time, and our stories, our dialogue naturally evolves.
That's right. And I've seen really cool things happen in communities as they transform into inclusive communities when you start to do that work. It's scary. We often feel embarrassed and vulnerable, but we can make it safe enough, I think, through these kinds of ground rules that people can do this and have a different kind of relationship. And we can start small and in that way start to change the world. And if we look at this next slide, which I think is the last one in this, which are the don'ts. Don't interrupt. Make negative gestures is important because sometimes they're just as painful to see. Like if if you're talking and I go or roll my eyes, you hear that just as loud as if I said something. Don't make others wrong, or we could call that attack. See, like if I say something you disagree with, you could say, Dr. Dave, you idiot, which of course is making me wrong. Or you could say, I have a different perspective. Words have power, and learning the skills, in saying things in ways that are less likely to activate the other, that's very useful in conversation. Side talk can also be damaging. Sometimes we've done dialogues, online using Zoom, and we don't let people use the chat, because we want them to interact with each other in the same way. And because when we experimented, we allowed chat to happen. People would say all sorts of stuff on chat. It became almost like online, or driving on a freeway where we felt free to yell about the traffic because people didn't really hear us. In other words, we want people to, even on Zoom, as much as possible, to talk with each other, rather than on a sidebar. And then
Sure.
finally, no teaching and preaching. And I laugh because it's hard not to do that. Being a teacher myself, it's easy for me to teach and preach. Um, but what happens when people teach and preach? We space out. We don't want to listen to it. Because we've been teached at and preached at since we were little. So we try to adhere to that too.
Yeah, let's continue our dialogue about dialogue here.
What would that be called? A meta dialogue? That could be your
There
next
we
book.
go.
Next
There
book,
we go.
Matthew. Meta dialogue.
That's right. So teaching and preaching, if you're conversing and you're trying to share your perspective, not necessarily trying to persuade or infuse knowledge or that kind of a thing, you're just sharing kind of your internal experiences. Is that fair to say that you're just not trying to influence, you're just sharing what your thoughts are?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if we're really honest, the word manipulation is often used to describe someone, in a negative way, but actually, it's very hard not to want to influence other people and manipulate. That's to be human is in part to want to get our needs
Yeah.
met. So I don't want to pathologize that or make that wrong, but teaching and preaching, I think, means more like how I do my conversation. It says in the Schmuckelhauser article from Harvard that, you're absolutely wrong what you just said. And they proved it with this study. And let me tell you more about, is
So it's
really
hierarchy.
different. Pardon me?
There's a hierarchy.
Well, exactly. Yeah, I might as well be standing up on the chair. That's really different than if I said to you, hey, I have a different perspective on that. Let me share that. Because
Yeah.
what I'm doing, of course, is I'm using these other, resources, things I've read, to try to win an argument rather than just say, here's my perspective,
Yeah.
right? And it's always okay. Actually, it interested me that in our dialogue class, students would often be reluctant to say their opinion with passion, as if somehow that was evil. And it can't be, that's the opposite of what we want people in dialogue to be able to say things passionately. You know, it's okay to be passionate. We just want people to be kind. You can be passionate and kind. Like, I notice I feel really strongly about this. Blah, blah,
Yeah.
blah, blah, blah. I can do that.
Passionate and humanizing.
They're not mutually exclusive. So you
Yeah.
don't have to be, so self contained and, I'm so sorry to say this, but I have a different, like, I have a different opinion. That's okay. We tell them, but I think we all know what kindness is. It's kind of golden rule, right? Treat people like you'd like them to treat you. And it takes practice, though. It doesn't happen overnight. And so, think couple again, because usually couples come in to see a therapist when the way they deal with differences becomes ugly and unkind and causes unnecessary suffering, and they have to learn these techniques, and become more skilled in order to not harm the person they perhaps love the most in the world. Same way with a parent and a child, and I have to learn that as a facilitator, of course, and model that. None of us
Hmm.
are perfect, but on a
Yeah.
one-on-one, how can I challenge somebody, as a therapist in a kind way?
It's a good point. You talked about parent and child. It seems like some of the most effective things to promote parenting is, I think there was a book, how to talk so your kids will listen and listen so your kids will talk, or something like that.
Nice. Yeah.
That's somewhat dialogue practice for in parenting. But at the same time, there is a hierarchy in parent-child relationships.
Well, that's right.
And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And so we just recognize that in the room. Dad and mom, it's their house. You live in that house. They love you, but they get to make some decisions. And they can invite your opinion, of course. And that may change as children get older. You get to make, what do you want to have for lunch may be a decision you get to make, but you don't necessarily get to make a decision about where dad's going to go work, or if we have to move, or stuff like that. And just being upfront about it,
Hmm.
and sometimes in dialogue you have people within hierarchies in an organization, and I have found that needs to be addressed right away.
Yeah.
Look around the room and notice people have different positions here. What's that like for you? Let's see how that works, and maybe it will work in this group and maybe it won't. you know we're trying to do some dialogues here in Utah around some of the violence that happened in the state recently, and
Yeah.
also in the news, and getting schools of social work together to talk can
Yeah.
be, on the one hand, you want, I think there's an argument for getting faculty, staff, and administrators together in the same room. On the other
Mm.
hand, that might not be fair to some people. Maybe fair is not the right word, but feels safe enough, because I might not trust that I can really say what I think, and so we're always looking at that and talking about it, and there's no perfect solution to that, but we may end up having to have affinity groups, like with
Hmm.
all the people that are administrators in one group and the teachers, and then try to do intergroup dialogue
Hmm.
if there feels like,
Yeah.
right, if there's a difference, and people that are listening to this, you might think about, and it's probably not a secret, everybody knows, what are the divides in your own community where you live locally. Like in Salt Lake, there's a freeway that runs north south, and we say there's an east and west side. And,
Hmm.
on the east side, there's more wealth. People tend to be more white. You know, on the opposite on the other side. A dialogue between folks from the east side and the west side. You know, probably is going to end up addressing those things. And probably in a lot of communities you have that. That it's not that difficult if we think about it together with the intent to try to help. What are the issues that divide us today?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And just in terms of, the practical solutions that we're seeing right now, the last time we spoke, we were in the middle of a war in Israel and in Gaza.
Yeah,
Somehow, what role do you think dialogue has played in mediating that war?
I actually have a couple films I used to show in my peace and conflict studies class, Matthew, which showed some people with a lot of courage in Israel and in neighboring, I think it was neighboring Jordan,
Hmm.
that organized parents who had lost children, either through so-called terrorism or so-called war, because they
Hmm.
overlap, right? And they would get together across the line, and it was illegal for them to do that. I think they met once at the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, and
Wow.
talk about their loss. The- you know, uh, and it took, the setup for that, as you can imagine, took some time.
Mm.
But bringing people together who are willing to do that, and
Yeah.
it was a very moving film. I also have another film that showed a valley in what's now the state of Oregon in the U.S., where a group of white people became curious about the indigenous people that lived in the valley they now live in, and they found some folks that still identified as part of that tribe, and they started dialogues,
Hmm.
and it's a very moving and well done film where the white folks mostly listened in the first dialogues, and they
Yeah.
invited these people to talk about what had happened and how they felt. It moved into some other things. Dialogue can help create the relationships, and then
Right.
they did some exercises outside of the dialogue where they helped fund a park, in the community, and they all attended a powwow together, for example, and did these other things, to kind of foster understanding and connection between the races, and so these are examples, and you know I'm not aware like what's going on along those lines right now,
Right.
in Israel or Gaza. I can't imagine too much that's going on like that,
Hmm.
but I would hope that there would be attempts to try to create that,
Yeah. Well,
and
to
you can
to
imagine
bring
that,
about some type of peace. Yeah. To
yeah,
promote some
you
peace.
know and the first thing I think you think is, how in the world could they ever do that? But then you think, Buber did it.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
it's got to be possible. you know.
Are those films that you talked about, are they in the public domain or are they proprietary?
I found them just through word of mouth or going online, and I would imagine there's other films like that. I think if you did a AI search or a
Yeah.
Google search for films on documentaries on dialogue,
Yeah.
and just
What
see
if
what
you
comes up.
can, could you send me the links? I'll put them in the show notes and
Yeah,
people
I
could,
think I have those in the old-fashioned format
yeah.
downstairs somewhere, and if I can find them, I'll send you
Yeah.
information on
Well, if
them.
they're just available on YouTube or anything like that, that would be great. Yeah, just send me the titles and I'll do some searching
Okay,
for you.
all right, yeah, for
It
sure.
does remind me of something I was listening to recently. Are you familiar with Daryl Davis with the Pro Human Foundation?
Not, I'm
So
sorry.
so Daryl Davis is just a really gifted musician, and he uh, would go to play in bars or different locations. I'm probably getting this wrong, but he would interface with people who were very different than he. And ultimately, he's been very successful with bringing people out of the Ku Klux Klan, out of Nazi groups, those kinds of things. And just recently, he was on the Joe Rogan show, and with somebody that he helped, bring out of kind of this white supremacist neo-Nazi organization. And it was interesting to just hear what their experience was, and it wasn't a one and done. It wasn't a magic wand. It took time for them to really come together, but he's been quite effective, and I think he has dozens of robes or hoods or uniforms of folks that have been influenced through dialogue. And
It reminds me of it's a little bit tangent, but related is one of my favorite ways to break the ice with groups where there's a lot of tension. When you have two groups together, is have people identify their favorite music and
have them identify what?
their favorite music. Like, who's your favorite
Yes.
musician? And it takes time, but if you can actually play some of those like little excerpts from a song, it's a
Yeah.
neat way to find out about other people that sort of exposes our commonalities. I did a dialogue once at a water conference in the
Yeah.
Great Basin where there was a lot of tension around the use of water for a metropolitan area that was going to be taken out of rural areas that were desert. And so there were all sorts of constituencies there, and they were not getting along. And so what we did at lunchtime for the dialogue was everybody had tell a story about water in their childhood, and it it worked out. You never know what'll happen, but people were talking about squirt guns, skinny dipping, waterfalls, canoeing, rainstorms. It was really, and at the end, it wasn't like everything was perfect and we were all lifelong friends, but it broke the ice, and the workshops were different in the afternoon per
Mm.
report. So I think about dialogue that way, like it can create opportunities to see people in a different light. It reminds
Yeah.
me of a story, about there was a tension, between this delegation from Russia, what was then the Soviet Union, and the U.S. around SALT talks. I think it was around nuclear disarmament and limiting the missiles, and they just were yelling at each other. And then they stopped that, and the facilitator said, "Let's all tell a joke." And so they went around the room and they told jokes, and maybe they passed out vodka or something too. I don't know. I'm not saying you need alcohol to form
Sure.
relationships, but in the laughter, things started to move. So I think those are kind of neat stories, and part of the training for us facilitators is find creative ways, to help people see each other and hear each
Sometimes
other.
nonverbal.
I think so. Yeah.
And that would be an interesting approach of nonverbal dialogue practice.
Well, we do that sometimes. Sometimes I'll have people stand up and dance your name in a movement. You got in 10 seconds, show how you feel today in a movement, you know, and you have people fall on the floor.
Hey, that's not funny. I mean, from somebody whose name is Matt.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, but you can have fun with it, right? And
Yeah.
so I think you're right. Like, yeah, movement can break the ice.
Oh, that's
All
great.
sorts of drawings. I have people do drawings sometimes. In social work conference, actually, for CSWE, I've had people. If I did a program on spirituality, I have them draw spirituality, on a piece of paper, and then they'd hold it up. Well, this is what or here's my religiosity, and
Right.
and that broke the ice. Because often there's so many techniques I could tell you, but yeah, you get the idea.
It's all about connection.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Thank
about
you for
humanizing.
giving me a chance to talk about something I love to talk about.
Well, this is great. Thank you so much, Dr. Dave. You've been very gracious in sharing before. I think what I'd like to do is just put maybe a couple of your preferred articles, if you will, in the show notes as well, so that folks can read up a little bit more. They can watch a few things. If we can provide people with some better awareness of dialogue practice, that would be
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. I'll do that.
okay. Well, thank you very much. We'll be in touch.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Pro Social Workers Podcast. We're grateful to our guests for sharing their insights, and to you, our listeners, for being part of this journey. If you'd like to earn continuing education credits, don't forget to visit our website at prosocialworkers.com, where you can register, pay a fee, complete a course evaluation, and take a quick quiz. We look forward to having you with us next time as we continue to explore how we can put the social back into social work.